There was one question in the poll that I can imagine would be striking if somebody was looking at this and wanting to see what were the news elements there. And there's this question about whether they would prefer to live in a dictatorship than a democracy. And 27% said that they would. But if media focused on that, that would be the wrong message from the poll, wouldn't it? Because it seems that your poll portrayed, in part at least, an optimistic picture with young people seeing politics as both honourable and important and believing in the power of their vote. Before we kind of get to that, can you say a little bit more about where that question came from? What led you to ask that question in the first place? Eddie?
Yeah, so I think this has been a really interesting issue. In the weeks leading up to our writing this poll, there was a Channel 4 survey that came out of 13 to 27-year-olds, which actually found that more than half, 52%, thought the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with Parliament and elections. And of course, that led to headlines in the way that headlines have to be compressed to saying that young people support a dictatorship. The actual question, as I've just read out, didn't actually include the word dictatorship. Now, colleagues of ours at King's College London have also done a piece of work on this in recent weeks, and we have now corroborated that when you actually ask the straight question, democracy or dictatorship, young people don't support a dictatorship. They are still supportive of a democracy. Now, you could argue actually that the fact that 27%, even when the question is put so bluntly, is quite a large number. That 20% of young people say, yeah, actually, I would go with a dictatorship over democracy. But the fact remains that by 2-1, young people are still in favour of democracy. And I think we felt it was important to get that question in just to establish that point at a time where headlines and so on is slightly running away with the idea that young people are effectively moving towards, the idea of a kind of one-party state with a strongman in charge. That is simply not the case.
And is there an optimistic view of democracy then from the poll? Is that coming out around the power of voting, the ability that young people feel that they have to make a difference?
Yeah, I would actually say that cautious optimism, let's put it that way. So majority of young people agree that politics is actually an honourable job to do, which again, I think that was a finding that surprised us to some extent. So 59% agreed to that. 72% though, however, also said politics is too divided. So we've got that, the kind of, I think Eddie mentioned it earlier, people are positive and optimistic and they do believe in democracy, but also they see that there are issues and some things to change and some things aren't working. Something that really surprised me is a finding around young people considering getting involved in organized politics. And 35% said yes. Now, that's not the majority, but that's every third person. So if we imagine every third person in the UK being involved in organized politics, that's a considerable amount. So that I found that quite encouraging finding, actually.
I agree with everything Elli just said. And if I could also add that the fact that we have this large cohort means you can segment quite accurately. And what was really interesting was when you start looking at young people by level of education, by their working background, those rates of optimism and that level of involvement really does vary massively. So, for example, 70% of those working full-time said they were optimistic about their personal future. Only 44% of those not in work said that they were optimistic. Mm-hmm. And similarly, if you asked about people who, in terms of doing political activity, again, those people in full-time work massively more likely to be doing so compared to people who are out of work. And I think this only reinforces one of the other big conclusions that we draw from this report, which is that for all we talk about Gen Z as being very different to every other millennials and all the rest of it, actually it's the differences within the generations, differences between young people, depending on their socioeconomic background, that are really important. And for a centre like us that is trying to get people from underrepresented groups into politics and into public life, I think that speaks very, very clearly that clearly we've got a lot more to do in order to try and reach out to those people who perhaps are not getting the benefits and the advantages of a good job and an education.
Yeah, and it definitely also underlines the value of this poll so that we can start to understand all of that complexity.
Yeah.
One final point on the poll itself. I was struck by the 2/3 almost of young people that said they thought democracy was in trouble. And what do you think that is telling us? What is it telling the parties, and what should we do about that? How should the parties, how should all of us respond?
What the poll has shown us is that young people support democracy. So it's wrong to say that they don't support democracy, but they clearly are worried about the state of democracy, and they are clearly sending a message to the way that politics is being done needs to change if they're in order to restore their belief in democracy. So I think the message is, and again, this is what young people told us. It goes back to that point around young people's need for a bit of financial security. I think what young people are looking for is politics to deliver on some of these absolute bread and butter basics. That is the key way to restore trust, we think, in politics and in democracy, is by evidence of delivery. We put it very clearly in the report. You want to build trust in politics, build more houses. That's the key priority for young people. They want to get a foothold, and that's how to restore trust in democracy. There's a few other issues that they've also talked about. The style of politics, again, asking them to rank what they see would be most important in terms of giving them faith in the way that democracy is delivered. They're looking for politicians to be more open and honest. They're looking for young people in leadership roles. They'd like to see some evidence that young people have got some agency here, that they're actually in decision-making positions. So I think those are some of the takeaways that we would draw.
Openness and honesty is not too much to ask, is it?